All right, today we're jumping into a therapy that tries to get right inside an offender's head and tackle the root cause of their actions, anger management.
And that's really the million-dollar question behind cognitive treatments, isn't it? If a crime begins with a thought, can you actually treat that thought instead of just punishing the action that follows? So how does this actually work? Let's find out.
Okay, so first up, we've got to get the essentials down. This is your core AO1 knowledge, what anger management therapy actually is, what it's based on, and how it's put together.
So when we talk about anger management, we're not just talking about, counting to 10. This is way more structured. It's actually a form of cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. The big idea here, which comes from Navaco's research back in '75, is that it's our thoughts, our cognitive factors, that kick off the emotional response that can explode into aggressive behavior. The goal here is to rewire that whole process.
The whole thing is broken down into 3 clear stages. It's a really logical progression. You start with thinking, then move to learning new skills, and finally, you put it all into practice. This structure is designed to build new, healthier habits from the ground up. Let's dig into each one. All right, stage 1, cognitive preparation. This is where the therapist and the offender basically team up to dig into the roots of the anger. They'll look back at past blow-ups to figure out what are the triggers and start to question those really automatic, often irrational thoughts. Like, was that person looking at you funny really a sign of disrespect, or is there another way to see it? This is all about taking apart those aggressive thought patterns.
Okay, once they know the triggers, it's time for stage 2, skills acquisition. Think of this as building a brand new toolkit for dealing with anger. And it's not just one tool, it's a whole set. On the cognitive side, they might learn positive self-talk to keep their cool. Behaviorally, they might get assertiveness training so they can communicate what they need without getting aggressive. And physiologically, they learn things like deep breathing to literally calm their body's response to anger.
And then comes the final stage, application practice. This is where the rubber meets the road. They actually practice their new skills, but in a totally safe environment. A lot of this involves role-playing situations that, in the past, would have ended badly. When they handle it well, the therapist gives them positive reinforcement, which is super important for building the confidence they'll need to use these skills for real. Okay, so we've got the theory down, but the big question is, does this stuff actually work? Now we get into the critical evaluation, the AO3 points. We're going to look at the good and the bad, and we'll use that peel structure to make sure our arguments are solid and exam ready.
So a big strength, right off the bat, the point is that anger management aims for a much more lasting change than something like behavior modification.
For our evidence, let's stack it up against behavior modification. Things like token economies in prisons. Those are all about rewarding or punishing what someone does on the surface to get them to comply inside the prison walls. Anger management is totally different. It's trying to get at the why, the thought patterns that cause the anger in the first place. One just manages behavior, the other tries to change the person.
And to explain why this is so important, gaining that insight is a total game changer. It gives offenders the power to understand their own anger and manage it themselves. That's a skill they can take with them long after they're out of prison, when there are no more tokens or rewards. It's about building self-control, not just forcing obedience.
So, to link it all back, because it's digging at the root cause and not just snipping the weeds on the surface, it's way more likely to lead to real, permanent change and, hopefully, stop them from reoffending down the line.
But, of course, it's not a silver bullet. And this brings us to a major limitation. The point is, the skills you learn in a quiet therapy room might not actually hold up in the heat of a real-world moment.
And we've got evidence for this from the criminologist Blackburn. He pointed out that, hey, role-playing a fight with a therapist is one thing, facing a real, unpredictable shouting match is something else entirely. He argued there's actually very little solid proof that it cuts down on reoffending long-term. And the explanation here really comes down to how artificial the therapy setting is. I mean, role-play is safe, it's predictable. It just can't simulate the adrenaline, the chaos, the pure unpredictability of a real confrontation out on the street. Success in the classroom doesn't always translate to success in the real world.
So, the link here is pretty clear. There's this big question mark over how well the therapy actually works out in the real world, and that gap between theory and practice is a huge knock against it.
Okay, another big problem to think about. The point is that anger management just isn't a one-size-fits-all fix. Its success really depends on the person. And for evidence on this, we can look at a really interesting study by Howells and his team.
What they found, after a major review, was that the therapy basically didn't do much unless the offender was super motivated to change and had some pretty serious, genuine anger problems to begin with.
And when you think about it, the explanation is just common sense, right? I mean, the therapy's useless if the person doing it doesn't want to be there or doesn't believe in it. It takes real commitment. Plus, let's be real, not all crime is about anger. Think about financial crimes or planned burglaries. This kind of therapy would be completely irrelevant for them.
So the link is that this really narrows down who this therapy can actually help. It might be perfect for a very specific type of offender, but that's a huge limitation when you're talking about trying to treat an entire prison population.
And finally, we have to talk about a really practical but massive limitation: the cost. These programs are expensive and take up a ton of resources.
I mean, for one thing, you need highly trained specialists to run these programs properly. Not just anyone can do it. And to explain why that's a problem, good therapy takes time, a lot of it, and a lot of commitment from staff. The tough reality is most prisons just don't have the money or the people to run these things the way they're supposed to be run.
So the link here is that money is a huge roadblock. You can have the best program in the world on paper, but if prisons can't afford to offer it, what's the point? It seriously limits how much good it can actually do in practice.
So, after all that, what's the verdict? Is anger management a powerful tool or a flawed cure? It seems like it gets right to the heart of the problem for some offenders, offering a real shot at lasting change. But its success is held back by the person's own motivation, the gap between the therapy room and the real world, and of course, cold hard cash. So I'll leave you with this question. How do we close that gap between a really promising theory and a much more complicated reality?